As we begin this morning, we're going to be looking at John 18, 1 through 27 today. But as we do, I want you to kind of keep this image or a picture in your mind, because what happens today in this passage, we're going to be moving through three different settings. This will begin in a garden where Judas comes to arrest Jesus with a group of people. It starts there, but then we're going to shift and it'll end up in at the courtyard of the high priest, Annas, who's serving at this time, and then also at the gate with Peter. And it's these last two locations, at the courtyard and at the gate by the courtyard, where there's this feeling like it's almost as if you're in two interrogation rooms. Now, we've probably all seen police drama shows where you've got a suspect and an accomplice, and they're held in two different rooms. Does this ring a bell to you? And you have the police officers, and they're questioning them, this sort of thing, and they're trying to get one to crack. Keep that in mind, because that's sort of what's going on here as we look at the way in which Jesus is not only betrayed, but the way Jesus is denied. Hear these words from John 18. After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with the police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you are looking for me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me." Then Simon Peter had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back in its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So the soldiers, their officer and the Jewish police, arrested Jesus and bound him. First they took him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jews that it is better to have one person die for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Since that disciple was also known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter was standing outside at the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. The woman said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing around it and warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. Then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If I've spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They asked him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Again Peter denied it, and at that moment the cock crowed. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In a way, this seems like a horrible place to end, and the cock crowed. But I want to back up And we're going to start looking at this in order to see if we can understand a little more what's going on here when it comes to betrayal and ways maybe we've experienced betrayal, but also perhaps maybe the ways in which we betray. This begins with Jesus being in the garden with his disciples. Now, this is a small group. This is obviously a place they had been to before, only they're not there very long by themselves, and Judas shows up with a new group of friends. And when Judas comes there, I find this kind of interesting because Judas is familiar with this spot. It's a place that they had gone to before, and in all likelihood, this is probably kind of a more intimate setting for Jesus and his disciples to spend time together and probably pray together. I don't recall ever reading a time where this was a spot, being in the garden, where crowds had gathered. So I find it quite interesting that Judas shows up with a crowd to confront this small group of followers in Jesus. He comes with a detachment of soldiers and police. That's one part of it. Now, they also don't come empty-handed. They come with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Now, why is this? This always struck me as kind of odd. I don't know about you, but if it's a small group of people and there's a detachment there, why are they coming? And maybe it's no different than when our police respond to something. They have a taser or a gun or something. But they come with torches and lanterns. That part doesn't surprise me. But there is some irony in that. It's the middle of the night, it's dark. They have to see. But I find it quite interesting that they come with these artificial sources of light, not with the truth, to arrest the light of the world. Isn't that amazing? Chew on that one for a while. But they come with weapons too. Now, maybe they're anticipating some sort of revolt. There is a little bit of a revolt. Peter draws a sword. That one kind of has thrown me for a loop too. What is Peter doing carrying a sword? But anyway, he's got one. Peter draws his sword and then attacks the high priest's slave, Malchus. Now, it's not in this gospel that we learn that Jesus heals Malchus's ear, but we find that in Luke. And so I wonder if Peter's not bound and taken away along with Jesus because Jesus heals his ear, or perhaps it's because Jesus kind of settles the situation down. He encourages Peter right away, put your sword back in its sheath. And then once this happens, they bind Jesus and take him away to go see Annas. Peter and another disciple who is not named follow along. And they all end up here now at the courtyard. This is where now we're going to have this split where we're going to enter two interrogation rooms. Are you ready to enter room one? Room number one starts with Peter. Peter is at the gate of the courtyard. And there's this woman who's guarding the gate. She must be pretty scary. A woman guarding a gate. And actually the word that's used here for this woman is she'd be kind of the equivalent of a slave or a maid. And so this tough-looking maid asks Peter, "Aren't you one of his disciples?" "I am not." Okay, so the first part of that interrogation ends. And immediately we shift to the other interrogation room. And now we've got Jesus here standing in the courtyard, and he's being questioned by Annas. And he wants to know some things about his disciples, but also some of the things that Jesus is teaching. And Jesus responds and says to him, "Well, I've been teaching in the temple courts, in the synagogues. Ask some of these other people. They know what I've taught." Well, one of the cops there doesn't like the answer and strikes him. So you got kind of a bad cop or a tough cop. Let's rough him up a little bit, and then maybe we'll get the answer that we want, even if it's not the truth. Well, it doesn't work. Jesus stands firm, tells the truth, and so he's bound again, And now he's taken off to Caiaphas, to Annas' son-in-law. End of that interrogation. We're back to interrogation room number 1. And Peter is asked again now, once he gets inside the gate and he's standing by this fire with the slaves and this group of police, he's asked by that group, aren't you one of them too? I'm not. And then the heat starts to intensify a little bit when a relative of the slave who cut off, the relative of the slave who had his ear cut off by Peter asks, are you sure you're not one of them? And Peter denies it. And the cock crows. And now we've got Jesus, who's been betrayed not only by Judas, but has also now been denied by a good friend. And I think there's something that we maybe need to understand when it comes to betrayal. There's different ways in which we experience betrayal, and I think there's different ways in which it presents itself. It can be really out there and blatant and quite in your face, very much like what we see and experience with Judas. But there's also ways in which it can be more subtle and come out of maybe a sense of fear, wanting to protect oneself. And this denial that comes through, and I think Abby hit it right on the head when she said that is a form of denial. When we say we're going to do something and we don't. Because Peter is the one who said, I'll follow you forever, Jesus. I won't fall away. Huh, really? And then he denies him 3 times shortly thereafter. And it's, I want you to take a minute here and think about a time in your life when you were betrayed. Does everybody have one? I'm going to go out on a limb here. I bet that made you feel really good, and you probably said, I can't wait to experience that again. Not. What sorts of things did you feel? Anger, hurt, sadness. There's a range of different emotions that I think can often accompany the way in which we experience betrayal as well. And sometimes we might want to react immediately, and sometimes maybe it can take a little bit of time. And then there's other times where, unfortunately, I've seen people respond and react to betrayal where it consumes their life because they're having a hard time processing what to do with what happened. And it can even mean that tears are shed, we have a difficult time sleeping at night. But I wonder if in our passage there's something that we see with the way of responses that might help us. And I found at least 2. Peter not only betrayed through his denial, but I think Peter also experienced a sense of betrayal himself. And so we see a response with Peter. And then Jesus, of course. So let's look at Peter first, shall we? Peter is there in the garden. His good friend is bound and they're arrested and they're ready to take him away. How many of us wouldn't want to respond like Peter did? I think for him there is a sense of betrayal there. Judas was his friend too. A good friend of his just betrayed another good friend of his. Have you ever wanted to step in the middle or do something or intervene when that's happened to you? And yet here's where I think there's a little bit of a problem. Because he wants to jump out and he grabs a sword and, okay, I'm here in the middle, I'm going to defend you, Jesus. I got this one. And maybe even we want to go, yay, Peter, go, go, go. There's a little bit of that I want to do. Seriously, I really do. It's like, go, Peter. But when it comes to the kingdom of God was not established and will never be fully realized through violence. Let me repeat that. The kingdom of God was not established, nor will it be fully realized through violence. So responding violently is probably not the best way to go. Jesus was not a violent person. The most angry, or perhaps you could say violent, we ever see Jesus is in the temple courts when he overturns the tables. That's it. Right? And yet, when we allow betrayal to sink in and allow maybe the hurt or the sadness to develop and start turning into anger, and I don't know if you've ever said these words, I've heard people say them, if it's the last thing I do, I will get her back. Until my dying day, I will make him pay. Now tell me who's the prisoner and who's bound. Who? So I think that's part of it with Peter. And then there's the way in which he goes, and he's in the courtyard there. And he's asked, do you know him? And remember, this all starts with a really intimidating looking maid. Maybe she was, I don't know. But this all starts with a maid. And he's asked, do you know Jesus? I am not. Denying is a form of betraying. Because what does betrayal really involve? Pardon? Lying. The truth is at stake. Trust. And if that trust is broken or truth is broken and we deny, we're betraying. And as I thought about it, a lot of this is kind of like being back in school to some degree. And I know this was the case when I went to school. There was always kind of this cool group of kids, right? And kids don't want to be left out of that cool group. Well, and I've seen this before where kids literally in junior high were like best friends. But then an opportunity presented itself to one of them to kind of shift and become part of the cool crowd. And then one ends up ditching the other and pretending even not to know the person anymore, like you don't even exist. This is almost like what's going on here by the fireside. And I get it, it's out of fear. But the denial, I don't know you because my reputation is at stake, or worse for Peter, his life is at stake. But you know what? Yeah, there is a reputation at stake. But you know whose reputation it really is? Jesus. It's Jesus' reputation that's at stake. And we see how Jesus responds to betrayal in the most amazing of ways. In the garden, when they come to take him, and he asks, who are you looking for? Twice he says, I am he, when they tell them, when they say to him, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. I am he. Ego eimi, I am. Words that were spoken by God to Moses by the burning bush. Same exact words. I am he. I'm the one you're looking for. He never backs down. He doesn't crack, whereas Peter cracked right away. And Peter's response, every time Jesus says, I am he, Peter says, I am not. Each time they're matched evenly. I am he, I am not. He stands on the truth. And though Jesus is the one who's bound and is led off, both to Annas and both to Caiaphas, Jesus is the one who's really free. Because he understands and knows that it's the truth and only the truth that will set him free. And it's the truth and only the truth that will set us free. And so he doesn't return the betrayal with any other kind or form of betrayal, but rather stands there, never backs down, never cracks, and tells the truth. Wow. How many of us crack under pressure? I think we all do. We all do. In some way, shape, or form, we all crack under the pressure. And what I find amazing is, we look at these different characters in this story, and hopefully it's helpful to remember that this is not a story about Judas. This is not a story about Peter. It's a story about Jesus. And for every time we've either been betrayed, or perhaps we betray, or maybe we're denied, or we deny, hopefully it's helpful to remember that Jesus is faithful. Jesus is faithful to the God that he calls Father, and he's faithful to this world whom he came to save and deliver. A world that had alienated itself, that we remember back way at the beginning of John 3, a world that had so alienated itself against God that God said, I'm sending my own son. I'm sending you my own son. Do you remember how I said the way this passage ends kind of is a little bit unsettling with the cock crowing? There is good news this morning, because that's really not the end of the story. There's good news in the middle of this that we learn with Jesus standing there saying, I am, and Jesus stands faithfully telling the truth. But also, as Pastor Wayne mentioned in the children's message this morning, Jesus comes again after he's resurrected and seeks Peter out. Read chapter 21. He seeks Peter out, and he asks Peter 3 times, once for every time he denied Jesus, do you love me? Do you love me? Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, I do. And hopefully that's our response as well. Would you pray with me?